So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining this user forum. I'm very pleased to introduce two of my colleagues, Andy Turner and Josephine Beach-Brandt from EPCC, and also Douglas and Harvey, who are members of the HPE Cray Centre of Excellence team, who are also going to be contributing this afternoon. So, Andy, I believe you're going to kick off, so over to you.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for that introduction. Hi, everybody. So the idea of this user forum session, I think it's the first user forum session we've actually run as part of ARCHER2, and hopefully they're going to become more frequent going forward to give people a chance for us to give you an update on what's going on the service, and for users to ask questions of the team here at EPCC and the team at HPE. But we thought it'd be useful to have one with the service due back next week sometime from its major upgrade to give you an update on what has changed, what the impacts on users are, what you should watch out for, and also to give you a chance to ask any questions about that you might have about what the system is going to look like coming back from the update. So as Claire said, I'm going to start off and do the sort of CSE or RSE view of what's changed on the service, the work we've been doing to evaluate the service, evaluate the system before it goes back to users. And then after me, Harvey's going to give a presentation from the HPE side, which will go into a bit more detail on things that have changed within the HPE software stack on the upgraded system, particularly new features that will be of interest to users that people can take advantage of on the new system. First of all, to give you an idea of where we are with the timeline. So originally we said from the start of the upgrade, which was about 3 weeks ago now, there'll be 3 to 4 weeks for the upgrade. We've now got the main system back with all the base software installed. There's a few outstanding tasks, but just this morning, the computational science and engineering team have got onto the service and started testing application software, and we're doing those sorts of final checks. The hope is that we'll have it back to users sometime in the first half of next week. Of course, there is still a chance, because we've only just got onto the system, that that there may be some last minute issues and things like that that delay it slightly. But we're reasonably confident that we'll be getting it back to you next week, and hopefully during the first half of next week. But we will send out more communication as soon as we have more concrete dates for the return to service. But obviously we haven't had huge amounts of tests because we only got onto the huge amount of time to test, so we only got onto the system this morning, really. So that is still work ongoing. But everything we've tried so far, or everything we've been doing so far, has looked very positive. So I have some good confidence that it's going to be early next week. So what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, sorry, the other thing I should say is if anybody has any questions while I'm talking, please feel free to interrupt. You can put your hand up in the interface, you can just ask a question in the chat, or you can even unmute and just shout at me to stop. I've got no problems with any of that sort of stuff. So if you've got anything that you want to ask me, then please just interrupt me. Otherwise, what I'll do, if nobody interrupts and we don't ask questions on the way, I'll hand straight over at the end of my presentation to Harvey, and he can go through his presentation, and then we'll do more general Q&A at the end for everybody. So what I'm going to talk about mostly is what the impacts on users are of the changes on the system, and I've got a slide in a moment that just summarises that. So we'll go over, and I've only got one slide on our experience so far because we've only been on a short amount of time, but I'll give you an update of what we've done so far. The obligatory partner logo slide as well. So this is my sort of TLDR version of impact changes. So some of them are pretty straightforward things, like the host keys have changed when you log in, so you're going to have to remove the old host keys from known hosts before you log in, or you get a warning. I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail in a moment. Check the versions of the centrally installed software. You need to update submission scripts and update your submission scripts and build processes as needed. Recompile test your software. Be aware that there's no more -2. There's a change you need to make to your job submission scripts due to a change in the way Slurm behaves in terms of the number of the CPUs per task option. There's a change in the definition of a Slurm socket on the system, which means it's now 4 cores rather than 16 cores as it was before the upgrade. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And if you use Singularity containers with MPI, there's some changes you have to make to job submission scripts. But that's sort of expected because versions of software have changed and things like that. So it's updated bind paths and library path settings. But I'll cover each one of these in more detail now. I did have one plea before I get into going into the detail, start going through these details. If you have publications that have resulted from work on ARCHER2 or anything associated with a DOI, digital object identifier associated with work on ARCHER2, then please log into SAFE and add the DOI. You don't need to add all the details. The SAFE will do that automatically for you. If you give it the DOI, it will go out to the internet, pull all the details from the DOI registry and populate them in the database. What this does is it provides a record of publication impacts associated with ARCHER2 and provides really important evidence of the impact of ARCHER2. Now that's not for the benefit for ARCHER2, though it does that, but it's also really important for us for making the case for future national services and future facilities going forward, showing the sort of impact. We really would appreciate if people go ahead and do that. There's some documentation on how to do it there. We'll also donate £1 to Save the Children for every publication that gets added to the system. And for people who have large projects or consortia, actually it can be pretty useful because each user can add their own publications. You can sort of gather the publications from across your large project consortia, and then SAFE allows a way to export that data in a way that can just be imported into ResearchFish during the submission window, which is around February each year, where you have to put all the publications into ResearchFish. So it can be used to gather those publications and then export them for use in ResearchFish. The publications also appear on the ARCHER2 website, and generally we're also keen to develop ARCHER2 case studies from when you work on ARCHER2. If you've got something interesting, then you can get in touch with us. Also, if we periodically review the publications, and if we spot something that we think looks interesting, we may come and reach out to you to try and make a case study of that piece of work. So that was just my sort of plug. That's my one plug slide, and the rest of it is just technical stuff about the upgrade. So changes post-upgrade. So this is just a bit more detail on the ones I summarized before. Login node host keys have changed, so you need to remove the old ones from your node host file before you try to log in. Typically that's at .ssh/home known host. It may be a bit different, particularly if you're on Windows or using different clients on Windows. If you forget to do this, you'll see an error that looks like this in green here. I've actually tried to put in bold the bit that's the important bit. It tells you where the offending key is. So for this one, it was in .ssh known host and it was on line 11. Okay, so you need to remove line 11 from that file, and then you'll log in and you'll get asked to accept the host key again. The host keys we're just in the process of getting the full set, and we'll put them up on the documentation in the usual place once we have them, so you can check that you're actually getting the real ones against the known list from the service. At the moment, the ones on the documentation website are still ones for the old service, but we're working on that today and getting that sorted out. So the upgrade has resulted in a reasonably large change in the sort of base and system software. So in particular, we're on a new version of the operating system. So the HPE Cray operating system is based on SLES SP4, which is, I think, either 2 or 3 steps up from where we were before the upgrade, which is quite a large change. And the HPE Cray programming environment software has changed a lot as well. Harvey will say a bit more about that in a moment and what that means. But we moved to a version which is 22.12. So a lot of things have changed. We've had multiple major steps in compiler versions, particularly around the Cray compiler and things like that. So many of the OS level software libraries have changed version, and all the HPE Cray software libraries have changed version. We have been working to test all the sort of centrally provided supported software that we install on the system, and we've been recompiling and testing all of that. We haven't run into any major problems. There's nothing big in the new compiler versions we found that stops things working. It's all been pretty straightforward, but what it does mean is that if you come to the service desk and something's not working post-upgrade, then the first thing they're going to ask you is if you've recompiled, if you compile your own software, that you've recompiled that software. So it's probably best to do that step beforehand before you do anything else anyway. This is a very short slide. Python 2 is no longer available on the service. Python 2 was deprecated in 2020. We've now moved to a version of the operating system which does not include any Python 2 support. So Python 2 will no longer be available or supported on ARCHER2. Of course, if you really need Python 2, then the standard advice you'll get from people is you should be moving to Python 3. You should probably have done that a while ago. But if there's some sort of legacy software that needs Python 2, then you're going to need to install or compile your own version of Python 2 on the system. Typically, the service desk won't provide very detailed support from that. And if you really run into problems compiling Python 2, of course we'll do our best to help you. But really, the best advice is you should really be moving or have moved to Python 3 by now. So that's a very short slide. It's just not going to be there. There's a couple of things that have changed in the scheduler in Slurm that you need to be aware of. One of them is around this CPUs per task option. This is particularly important for users who either underpopulate nodes by using less than the full number of cores on a node for processes, or run hybrid jobs where you have MPI processes and OpenMP threads together. The setting from CPUs per task, these set in your job script, say in the sort of header bit, which has a hash s batch at the start and then CPUs per task option. Before the upgrade, that setting would have propagated automatically down to any S runs within your job script. So when you did a parallel launch, you'd pick up the same value of CPUs per task that you'd set at the top level with the S runs. That is no longer the case. Okay, and the typical symptom of this is that if you are underpopulating or have hybrid, particularly when you have hybrid executables that are using MPI processes and OpenMP threads or some other sort of threading, you see a catastrophic loss of performance, because what Slurm then starts to do is when it runs the S run and the CPUs per task isn't being propagated, so it defaults to 1, it starts to put multiple threads on the same core. Okay, so you just see a catastrophic loss of performance generally as the cores become oversubscribed with threads. The solution, there are two solutions. One is you can explicitly use the CPUs per task option to SRun, so you can just repeat the option again on the SRun command. If you just want to make it propagate and have the old behavior back, then you have to add this extra line to your job submission script before any SRun commands, and you essentially export the SRun CPUs per task option and set it to the value that's being inherited from the Slurm job. Okay, so it's an extra line in the job script. We've gone through the user documentation and updated all the example job scripts to add this line. So hopefully, people pick it up from the documentation, the job scripts up from the documentation, then you'll see this new line in where it needs to be. But as I said, if you really poor performance in hybrid code, check that that you've got this option, and you can use the XT-High program, if you look in the documentation, to check the placement of processes and threads before you run your application. So that's always a good check if you see poor performance, especially with a change in behavior like this in Slurm. The other thing that's changed in Slurm is the definition of a socket.
Andy?
Now, yeah. Go on, Harvey.
Can I mention something on the previous slide? So the other thing we've seen, and I think it applies to ARCHER2, so hopefully it doesn't, I'm not wrong, which is that if you have a script that simultaneously says what CPUs per task is and tries to set a binding mask, Slurm doesn't like you setting them both simultaneously now. It doesn't need the CPUs per task because that information is already involved in the map that you've set to bind to individual CPUs. So just be aware, if you have an existing script that stops working, that might be the reason why.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think a small minority of users might use some sort of explicit binding scheme to CPUs, but thanks, Harvey, that is worth noting as well. The CPUs per task and the binding options are mutually exclusive in that case. What was that up to? Oh, socket definition change. Right, so Slurm has this concept of sockets. Now, on AMD processors, a socket has never really corresponded to an actual CPU socket, which is a single physical processor piece of silicon. You know, is the standard, usually what people mean by socket, but that's not what Slurm means by socket, particularly on AMD CPUs. Before the upgrade, a socket was a set of cores that shared essentially a memory controller. So it was a set of cores that had equivalent access to a bank of to DRAM. Okay, so that was 16 cores on the old processor. So there were 8 sockets in a node, or 8 Slurm sockets in a node. On the upgraded system, this has changed. So each socket is now 4 cores. This corresponds to what's known as a core complex within the AMD Rome processors that we have on ARCHER2. And the 4 cores all share L3 cache. So socket now corresponds to a different part of the NUMA hierarchy on the system. This, in some sense, this makes sense because actually the CCX is really the sort of natural unit for an AMD processor. So it is, in some sense, an improvement, but it is also something to be aware of. It really affects you if you use a cyclic placement scheme. Okay, so if you use something like distribution, I'll put it in the chat. If you use an option that looks like an option to SRun that looks like this, and some people use this if their code is memory bound to get the best memory performance. So distribution block cyclic. The second cyclic here refers to sockets in Slurm speak, actually NUMA regions or particular NUMA region definitions on ARCHER2. So in the use placement, that would place the first process on core 0, the second process on core 4, 8, third on 8, and so on and so forth, as it cycles through each of the different Slurm sockets, which of course aren't really sockets. Previously, it would have been 0, 16, 32, and so on and so forth. So if you use any sort of cyclic, the default decomposition that we recommend for people is block, which means that for things that processes are just placed sequentially across the node. So process 0 will be on core 0, process 1 will be on core 1, so on and so forth. But some people do use this cyclic decomposition, and the behavior and placement will change on the upgraded ARCHER2 compared to that. Beyond Slurm changes, Singularity containers and MPI. I didn't, trying to fit all the things that have changed, or the settings that have changed on a single slide wouldn't really work here. But simply due to changes in the software library versions and their locations, if you use Singularity with MPI, you need to update your container launch configuration. You need to update the locations mounted from the host system in the containers. That's the binds and the directories or files that are bound into the container from the host. And you need to update LD library path within the container, so the running container, which can be done by an environment variable to point to the correct host libraries. You can see, I put the link here to the Singularity with MPI on ARCHER2 docs. Look there, that has the right settings to put your job submission scripts for this sort of stuff. We've also actually updated the instructions on how to build containers that incorporate MPI in the documentation. Specifically, we've changed from instructions on how to build using Singularity to instructions on how to build your container images using Docker instead, because typically for people who have Windows or Mac laptops, it's easier to build containers using Docker or the Docker desktop, and then use them with Singularity on ARCHER2 rather than trying to build directly with Singularity, which is harder to get running on Windows and Mac OS. But please take a look at the documentation there. Hopefully we'll have another more detailed look at containers on ARCHER2 in an upcoming webinar or some sort of session like that as well. We will have a course if you're more interested in learning more about containers. I think we're due to have a course over the summer or just after the summer on using containers in general. And that teaches you about Docker and Singularity. So keep an eye out for that coming out on the ARCHER2 website. So I'm almost at the end of my presentation now. So the CSE experience so far, and I did warn you that this was going to be very small because we've only got access from the start of this morning. We have been able to run small-scale testing on the test and development system. That's only 8 nodes, so we're not running any large-scale tests or anything like that, but that did give us confidence that generally compilation works fine. We haven't run into any big problems with the new versions of compilers or MPI libraries or any of the system libraries or anything like that. The instructions that work to compile things on ARCHER2 pre-upgrade typically work post-upgrade. And I'm sure Harvey will say some more about the Cray compilers in particular. But generally, particularly with GCC, we've seen no difference between the two systems in terms of compiling behavior. The performance at small scale on our TDS system seems to be in line with pre-upgrade, but we haven't been able to test on very large node counts yet. So I can't give you really definitive answers on that. Large scale jobs do seem to work on the main system. So we've run quite a few just over 4,000 node lamps calculations this morning so far on the main system. Haven't had a really chance to look into the performance in detail yet, but the experience so far with things is that the performance should be in line with what you'd seen on the system before, and that we can get very large MPI jobs using real applications to run on the upgraded system. So that's a positive thing. The evaluation is continuing over the next few days this week by the CSE team. We're running stuff overnight and into the weekend and things like that in preparation for releasing the service back to users next week. But I don't think we're not anticipating any big bumps in the road, certainly in terms of application stuff anyway, from what we've seen so far. Right, so I didn't have anything else. This is my final slide, so I've just put my TLDR slide back up. We do have there's a link at the bottom there. I will also put it in the chat that has the most up-to-date information on what we've been doing with around the upgrade process timelines. It has all the notes about the issues I've talked, the changes that I've talked about here. So it has that stuff, and we're keeping that up to date as far as we go through the upgrade, and even once the upgrade's finished, we'll leave it there as well. So that's the right place to look for more information or more detailed information on this sort of stuff. But other than that, nobody stopped me for any questions. So I think what I'll do is I'll hand straight over to Harvey and let him do his presentation, then we can have sort of a more general Q&A when he's finished at the end. So Harvey, if I stop sharing my screen, are you ready to share yours?
Yeah, I am. Can you see my slide?
I can indeed see your screen. Yeah. That looks good, and we can hear you clearly as well.
Okay, I don't know how I'm sharing 2 windows at once. That's intriguing, but that's what the message is telling me. Yeah, so as Andy said, myself and Douglas are working within the Centre of Excellence for ARCHER2. And you might have come across us before, either you put in queries that have come through to us, or you've been involved with one of the training courses we've done or something else. So we were asked to give some update on what had changed on the system, particularly what had changed in the software stack. And that can encompass various things, right? So the system and management software has completely changed. Pretty much everything in that is at a new version. So this encompasses the operating system that's running on compute nodes and running on login nodes. It encompasses the software that's managing the slingshot network and the firmware for that network and the firmware for much of the hardware devices. And of course, it encompasses the programming environment that you've all been using. So I thought I'd put a few notes on the system software side, although this isn't really something that you generally come across or care about. And so some of these updates aren't really relevant to ARCHER2, certainly not today, because they're around hardware support for new hardware capabilities or new products. So for example, new GPUs, that's one thing that the software stack has to catch up with. And so you see, depending on the platform, you'll see NVIDIA toolkits or ROCm stack from AMD and their respective compilers, so new support for those types of things, support for different versions of the network hardware. So for example, there's a newer capability with the slingshot networking available on some systems where there are new NICs to replace the Mellanox ones that we have on ARCHER2. So these things are not really relevant to ARCHER2. But you may be interested if you have access to systems elsewhere. There's also a capability for GPU nodes that's new, which is attempting to address any performance issues of interference with applications and the driver stack that has to run somewhere to communicate with the GPU. So we've tried to keep application threads away from those OS threads that are running GPU services. And so that's more the hardware side. If we think of the system software side, then pretty much all of the components have updated versions. And then the second thing that I think is quite important is that there are many security fixes that have been implemented in the stack, and that in fact was one of the major drivers for the upgrade, which was that at some point we had to move to a consistent stack of software, and it was impossible to upgrade just individual pieces of it and keep going with the security fixes that would have become more and more important as we'd gone on. And there's going to be a little bit of repetition here. So as Andy mentioned, that the OS we're running is now based on SLE's 15 SP4, and that means that OS distribution is not distributing Python 2 anymore. Now the programming environment wasn't supporting Python 2 anyway, but you could have been using what was provided by the OS. And as Andy mentioned, we have checked that you can build Python 2. So there is certainly one community who really want to continue doing that, and we've checked that that's possible, but it's not something that's supported. And then the other thing, which is a bit intangible, that if you trawl all of the release notes for all of these things, then there are many mentions of improvements of scalability of various aspects of the system behavior. So some of that is routing in the network. Some of it is more like system administration steps, or for example, booting 5,000 nodes at once, reconfiguring 5,000 nodes at once, those types of activities where, unless they're scalable, they take a very long time. And then some improvements to the way that power monitoring is done for the cooling distribution units. And then for Slingshot itself, there's an improved monitoring infrastructure, but this is something more on the administrator side, and that will continue to be improved. And that's an area I think we do want to look at and provide, in fact, even user monitoring as well at some point in the future. And then the other thing that's quite important is improved error detection and resiliency for issues that can happen in the network, particularly issues that might be in multiple places at once. And then the other aspect of this is that sometimes you have hardware that is quite marginal. So you might see a link that from time to time stops working and then comes back again. And the software wasn't very good at dealing with some of those things. So I would say that in general terms, the resiliency has improved quite a lot. So that was just an insight into some of the things that have been going on the system side, but we probably much more care about the programming environment. So this is, for example, the compilers, the MPI implementations, the scientific libraries, the module system, the wrappers that everybody uses. So and before the upgrade, we had multiple versions. So we had 2104, 2109, and 2204. And the more recent ones were available if you did do a switch to the module environment. So I don't know how many people did do that. So how much change you see in some sense depends on whether you were using the default in the past. So the latest compilers available previously was CCE 13, GNU 11, and AOCC 320. So and after the upgrade, CCE is now at 15, so that's gone up a couple of major versions. There is a GNU 12, but we're making 11 the default because GNU 12 seems to have some very aggressive optimizations which have affected accuracy in some applications. So the default is GNU 11. And the default program environment in general is 22.12. because we had to fix one when planning for the upgrade. So it's always a moving target, if you like. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was that there is a new website made available by the PE group. So they did realize that people were finding it difficult to get access to documentation and information about the releases, and those were in different places. So for example, there's a GitHub site that has release information in it. There's an HPE support site that has things like the release documentation for each release and the release notes and the documentation, say, for the Fortran compiler. That was quite tricky to get hold of. So they're trying to put this all in one place. So this was just announced a few weeks ago. So the initial thing is there now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pick things that we went through change logs and tried to pick things that were indicative of them adding new features, or we thought might be interesting. I mean, they might be boring in some sense, but what I didn't do is go through and count how many fixes there were. So there are hundreds of bug fixes in particularly in the compilers and in MPI and in other components. And we have actually, particularly Douglas, we've been going through previous queries and checking that they have been resolved. So we can see ourselves that fixes are now available that are helping people who've had issues and have submitted queries on them. So I wasn't going to attempt to go through any of those. So one thing I'll mention is that there was this range of updates from 2104 to 2204. So those are the defaults that were available, that were in play. So if you didn't switch to the latest environment on ARCHER2 before, then you might not have noticed some of these differences. And you would have needed to have loaded CPE 2204 to get those more latest features. And there probably isn't that much to highlight there, other than some kind of small updates. But one thing that, in fact, we noticed this morning that people hadn't noticed is that in the last release there was something called mixed compiler modules. So I thought it was worth just mentioning what that is. So there are some mixed modules. So that they have names like GCC-mixed. And the idea of these modules is that LMOD has a hierarchy, and it has a way of defining sets of modules such that some are incompatible with others. So what that meant was, if you imagine you had the Cray programming environment loaded and you wanted to use the latest GNU compiler that was on the system, you couldn't just go and load to the GNU compiler because it would switch out the CCE compiler. So that was something you couldn't do. So the GNU compiler you would have by default was the system one. So the idea of these modules is that they enable you within the LMOD framework to load the current default other compiler than the one you have loaded as the program environment one, right? So the example here is that you've got program Cray loaded, which is the default, but you want to get the newer CCE that the PE provides, but not the system one. So here I've done GCC-version, and I'm seeing I've got 750. So that's the in-user bin. So that's the one provided by Susie. And it's always old, right, this one. So, and then you can see that I've got programs Cray loaded. And then I might do module load GCC mixed. And what this is doing is it's loading a GCC compiler, but it's not enabling wrappers to use that compiler. All it's doing is making that compiler available should you want to use the var compiler, right? You want to call GCC or G++. And you can see here, GCC-version is returning 12.2. But CC is returning 15. It's returning the Cray compiler. So the circumstance where you might want to do this is you might want to, within your normal logging environment, assuming you always stick to programs Cray, or you're doing a build where you're building for compute nodes with programs Cray, you might want to build some ancillary tool with GCC and just natively use GCC, no wrappers, no MPI, nothing else. So that's the circumstance that you would do this, and a similar model exists for AOCC, for example. So then I just picked a few things looking through the release notes. So for the compilers, we've gone from 13 to 15. So I'm starting now at where we were before. So that and these compilers are now based on the equivalent version of LLVM, and the C compilers are tracking Clang releases as well. So, and there's been general performance improvements, both for CPU and GPU code. Now there are new features that weren't there before. So, and these are support for things called sanitizers. And I thought that was interesting enough that we've put together a few slides, and Douglas will mention something once I'm finished with these few slides I've got So I'll give you a little bit more detail on that, because I think that is quite a useful thing to know about. And then there are some small changes. The OpenMP SIMD support is on by default. You needed an option before to use those pragmas. For GPU people, OpenAC support has moved along. The other thing that they've highlighted is that the Fortran compilers have traditionally used TC-malloc, and eventually they want to go away from that. There has always been an option H system alloc to switch that back to the system libraries. So this is something that might go away. So if you actually use that and really care about it, then it might be something to look at for the future. And then the last one is super important. So this is a question I'm sure you have, which is, do you need to recompile things? And the official answer is yes. And this is one of the reasons why that answer is yes, because there are real incompatibilities for certain compilers and libraries. That means things won't work, right? There are some situations where you might be lucky, and it's, you know, we had this through the whole lifetime of Archer, that we installed new programming environment releases, although in theory backward compatibility was never kind of officially supported. It generally worked for a few releases, and people routinely did that. But you know, if developers aren't going to sign, you know, their life away to guarantee those things, so we are recommending definitely that people recompile. I mean, I know what you're likely to do is just set LD library path and run and see what happens, which is natural. And then for MPitch, there are some smallish changes. So there are some MPitch-like wrappers, you know, the MPI-CC, MPI-F90 wrappers. These now are in the path. So don't be confused by these. These aren't a new and exciting way to compile an application. What they are is they're there for scripted environments like SPAC, you know, build environments that like to spot those things. So there were some customers who requested that, so that build systems would spot some driver script that would at least do the right thing, and not go for the, you know, a driver script that was definitely not going to do the right thing because they picked it up from some other place. There's been improvement to MPI-IO to support striping of stripe sizes of greater than 2 gigabytes. Improvements to some of the gather scatter algorithms in MPI. And then some other improvements to I/O. And then the other area, which we've not managed to test yet, but there is certainly better documentation on how to do dynamic process management in MPI. So this is, for example, if you want to do MPI com spawn, and that was always a tricky thing to do before. It was quite tricky on ARCHER2, and in fact, I don't know if anyone did it because the way to do it wasn't really documented, and nobody had asked me, so I'm assuming nobody does this. But this methodology has changed a bit, so we haven't quite got around to testing it. So if that's something you're interested in, look at the man page and give it a go, or get in contact with us if you have any issues. So then a few new capabilities, and these are a bit esoteric, so probably of interest to very few people, but I'll just mention them. So one is that some of the tools used, and well, some still do, a framework called MRNet, which I think came from Australia, might have been Monash, and this is a framework that enables you to aggregate multiple pieces of information in a scalable way. So this was used by the tools that needed to aggregate stack traces. So imagine you have 5,000 stack traces, and you'd rather not see 5,000. You'd like to see 1 or 3, you know, where they diverge across a set of processes. And that's what this tool did. But it is available for users. There's not much documentation. It's the kind of thing where you kind of have to know how to use it, and then the header files are all there, and the library's there, so you can compile a tool that would use this. So if you have a project where you think that sort of scalable tool might be of interest, then it would be worth looking at. And then the other two things I think are relevant for people, probably if you have containers with OpenMPI in them. So the first one is Slurm now supports PMIX. So in Slurm, if you do srun --MPI equals list, you can see the supported frameworks for starting up an application. So traditionally we had a Cray framework and we had PMI2. So PMIX is the only choice you have with more recent OpenMPIs. The second thing here called MPIX Lite, this is a tool that whose goal is to translate between the ABI used by OpenMPI and MPitch. So in the Cray software stack we have MPitch. So we always had a MPitch ABI compatibility, but that was between MPitch-like implementations. So that would have covered the MPitches and Intel MPI. But this is extending that idea to OpenMPI. So and we tested this when it was a beta thing. So I've not tested the actual one that's just been installed, but we will. So these are things I set up, which I think are most likely useful if someone's got a container that has been built with an application in it linked against OpenMPI, then this is part of the toolbox that might help you getting that going if that's what you want to try to do. So just to let you know in case you're interested. So then on the tool side, there are a range of tools that you may or may not be aware of. If you're not aware of them, join some of our courses and learn more. So GDB for HPC's had some improvements. Can now within GDB HPC you can launch through an SBatch job, and it's got a new command to relaunch an application. That was a real pain before because for some applications you needed quite a lot of command line arguments to specify exactly how to launch and provide the the Slurm, the correct arguments for Slurm and for the application, and you had to repeat that. So the ability just to do a run that does a rerun was quite good. Then abnormal process termination. So I think they've now finally fixed the issue that this wasn't producing line numbers. This was a kind of LLVM Linux problem, and that's now been resolved. So we should be seeing line numbers from those now. And let me see, anything else interesting here? Yeah, and they've changed a bit about how the core files are generated. And just a reminder here that this tool can down select the number of core files you get from an application. So you do have the ability to choose which ranks you get core file from, which is quite cool. Yeah, I think and the sanitizers for HPC thing at the bottom is what I'd want Douglas to let you know about. So, but before I do that, a few things about Slurm. So when we first started with ARCHER2, there was a different syntax for heterogeneous jobs that we used, and that syntax seems to work again. So if you remember having heterogeneous job steps, this is where you do an npmd launches. We switched how we did that in the past, so the old syntax works again. I'm not suggesting anyone changes. And then the other thing I noticed is that now the alternative output format from some of the Slurm commands, the YAML and JSON ones, that does work. You get extremely verbose output though, and I haven't managed to try it on a system with anyone when a job's running yet because the TDS was empty when I looked at this. But it's the kind of thing you should look at if you write scripts that post-process the output from sinfo, sq, those types of things, that might be of interest to you. And there were many other little changes mentioned for people who looked through the release notes. So I'm not able to see the chat, just to let you know if anyone has anything. So Douglas, can you take over and mention a little bit about this new support for sanitizer?
Yeah, sure thing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. So sanitizers for HPC. So it's a new feature on ARCHER2, so it wasn't available previously, even with the newest programming environment. So we decided to include a few slides on the tool just to introduce it and give a small example on its usage. So what is sanitizers for HPC? So it's a debugging tool which provides them with an ability to detect memory leaks, data races, deadlocks, suggestibility issues, and other errors that might occur in a parallel code. So this is achieved using static instrumentation at compile time. So via a compile flag, if sanitized listed here in purple. So you add this during compilation, you specify which sanitizer or sanitizers that you wish to use. So the sanitizers that are available are address, leak, and thread. All three of those are available for C and C++. Currently, Fortran only supports the address and the thread sanitizer. There's also a limitation that the address and the thread can't be used simultaneously. And then any information about any possible errors is then given to you it's provided to you at runtime to the standard out. This may look quite familiar to those who are already used these sanitizers as part of LLVM, for example, for use of serial applications. I have advised people in the past who've had queries that they submitted to the help desk to use the leak or address sanitizer to try and debug their code. What what sanitizers for HPC adds is that it aggregates messages across ranks to provide debugging information for parallel applications. So using essentially what Harvey had mentioned previously with MRNet. So it does it in a similar manner to how it's done for other debugging tools we provide, like GDB for HPC and Valgrind for HPC. So this is supported, not yet all binary, but this is supported in ARCHER2 for both the Cray and the GNU compiler. Yeah, with the listed limitations I've given here, and more information you can find it on the man page, or you can find it at the new CPE documentation page under debugging tools. So it's Harvey, next slide. Okay, so a typical workflow for using the tool would be the following. So say, for example, we have a small reproducer for a memory leak that we detected in our application called leak.c. We would compile this with debugging enabled, so including this fsanitizer flag with our choice of sanitizer. So this is a leak, we'd use the leak sanitizer. We then load the sanitizers for HPC module. The example here, we're doing it through an interactive session. You could do it through a batch job also. So we request an interactive session with the required usage for the job that we're launching, and then we launch our application using sanitizers for HPC with the following syntax. So -l passes arguments and quotes to the system launcher. So in the case of ARCHER2, this is Slurm's srun, and the executable is then listed after a double dash, and any arguments passed to that executable also. So Harvey, next slide. We just got a small example. More examples can be found at the man page. So for example, here we have a small Fortran program called address.f90. So this writes, so there's a write on line 8 outside the bounds of an array called array that we've defined, causing a buffer overflow. So we compile this with the address sanitizer specified. We run using sanitizers for HPC, and then we get the following output to standard out. So what we get is it shows that on rank 0, it specifies that there's been a buffer overflow occurring line 8 from address.f90, and then we just get a summary at the end. Of course, this is just for, this is a serial application, it's just on one rank. But if we were to run an application over many ranks, it would provide an aggregated view of any errors and what ranks that they're occurring on. That's everything I had, Harvey.
Yeah, so one thing I forgot to mention, well, I was in two minds of it. So when I was talking about the compiler, so one thing we didn't show was an example of looking at thread sanitizers. So, you know, for example, this is where you might have an OpenMP program with multiple threads and you're looking for data races. So an example might be you have an OpenMP loop and more than one iteration of that loop is reading or writing the same variable. So this is the kind of thing that these tools look for. And as well as the sanitizer that you can use as Douglas just mentioned, there's another one, ironically or not, called ARCHER, right? So there's an ARCHER OpenMP runtime data race detection tool. And the link here links you to some information about that. And it's an alternative tool that sort of uses most of the same framework, but you link a special library. You do -l ARCHER, and you have to make sure that library is in your LD library path when you run the program. And what you'll see is if you run that on a program with, at least the example I tried, I ran it on a program with such a problem that I had two iterations of the loop accessing the same variable, and it reported some information about that for me. So that looked quite good. The ARCHER one has a capability beyond the other one that you get by default, in that it attempts to spot if you see the same problem more than once, because otherwise you'd get a report continuously for the same problem as you traversed the loop nest. So just to mention that exists. So these, if anyone's interested in that, just have a look and see if you if it's of any interest to you. So that's all we had really. It was just we picked some things we thought might be interesting or might be less interesting, but hopefully between both of our presentations that was useful. And I'll give the slides to Claire, who can make them available to people.
Okay, so, oh, sorry, my button isn't working properly. There you go. So thanks, Harvey. Thanks, Doug, for that. And we'll deep dive into the changes to the CPE stuff. We've got plenty of time now, we've got a bit of time now for questions or anything we haven't covered that people want to ask. So has anybody got any questions? I mean, feel free to type them into the chat, put your hand up, just shout out, and that sort of thing. And we'll do our best to answer them. No, it's very quiet. Maybe that just means that we tried to guess what questions people would ask and tried to answer them all in our presentation. So maybe it just meant we were good at guessing, or maybe it just meant we were so boring that everybody's gone to sleep. It will be the other option there. So either of those or both of those possibilities exist. So what I would say is, if you do think of any questions, or we covered something and you have to think it over overnight or something like that, you want to know the answer to something, then please do email the service desk. So that's support@archer2.ac.uk, and we'll get that passed on to the right person to answer your question, and we'll do our best to help. Otherwise, just keep an eye out for updates on when the system's returning to service. As I say, it's all pretty positive at the moment. And there's a few things that both HPE and the systems team here at EPCC are running through to iron out, sort of to make sure things run smoothly in terms of returning to service. And the CSE team are continuing to test applications, performance and things like that as well. The FAQ pages, as Joe says, will have any details up to date. So the latest, we'll keep those with the latest information, even if we can't send 4 user mailings a day, for example, because that would just annoy everybody. So we will update those pages with the information as we have it. But other than that, we're looking forward to getting everybody back on the system and hopefully getting ARCHER2 fully loaded again. I know it was very much in demand before the system went away. So thank you for your attention today, and keep an eye out for future messages. And as I say, we're always here to help if you want to ask us any questions. And thank you for Claire for setting up and organising and keeping us all right with the technology and stuff like that. It just wouldn't work without her input.
Many thanks, Andy, and thanks to Harvey and Doug as well.